Good morning. It looks like we live in a snow globe that just got shook up out there, but it is pretty if you don't have to drive in. I hope this morning as you sang Blessed Assurance, you could offer your praise, knowing that Jesus is yours. We sing Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine. That his grace has washed away your sin, and that you belong to him. You know, last Sunday, I got to be in 3 worship services. After I talked about the praises and the worships, I was here Sunday morning. I went to the Eden Center and spent the afternoon with them in worship, and then we gathered together as a community for the Thanksgiving service. And I had to just pause for a moment right where I was and just praise God for his presence. You know, we talked about how we worship God with our presence, but we are so blessed by his presence. And that last Sunday, it was just palpable. I could feel it in the car with me. And so I just thanked him so much that he sent his son, his spirit, for us. He didn't have to, but he did it out of love. And so as we go into this Christmas season, I want you to just really focus on the love that God sent his son out of love. What a gift. And you know, we were also singing about Open Up the Heavens. And as we were singing it this morning, I imagined the choirs on top of those walls singing that song. I don't know what they were singing, and I'm sure it wasn't that song, but I imagine them just singing, your presence is in this place, your glory on your face. We're looking to the sky. Lord, unveil our eyes. You're standing with us now. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason we're singing, Open Up the Heavens. We want to see you. And they sang it so loud that nations far away could hear it. We've gathered together. We're worshiping with our presence. We've given our tithes and our offerings of our possessions. We have worshiped him with our praises. And I believe he's standing right here. And some of us would look around and we'd get discouraged by the numbers. The only number that really, truly matters is God is here. Yeah. And God plus any one of us equals everything. And so I'm thankful for all of you that are here, all of you that are listening online. Last week we talked about the Israelites and their nation making a binding agreement before God. They had professed their faith. They had publicly signed their names. They committed themselves and future generations to come to follow God, to dedicate their lives to following him faithfully. Those whom the lot cast fell were obedient, and they moved inside the walls of Jerusalem. They reestablished their nation. They reestablished the temple worship. They were reestablishing their community. They dedicated these walls, and the choirs sang their praises to God on top of the walls so loud. Everyone was involved. They were not just spectators. They were participants in praising God, in dedicating their walls, and committing their lives to God. They had given their time, their talent, their resources, all as a form of worship. They were on fire for God when chapter 12 comes to a close. And then we begin Nehemiah chapter 13. And we see now that the celebration has ended and real life has begun. Promises have been made. Lives have been uprooted and replanted. Proclamations were made with their voices, and dependence on God was written down, signed, and sealed. Praises had been sung. That was the easy part. Their promises would prove difficult for them to keep. Staying the course takes effort. It takes work. Every single day, rededicating our lives to him. We may be passionate and sincere when we make a commitment and we take a stand, but to stay on course requires you to be actively involved each and every day. Complacency and compromise are just waiting. They're waiting and ready the minute we get lazy. Complacency and compromise. William Booth, the founder of Salvation Army, said this: "It is the nature of a fire to go out. You must keep it stirred, keep it fed, and keep the ashes removed." The same is true for our passion for God. if you want that passion, that desire for more of God to keep burning in your life, you've got to stir it in your heart. You've got to hunger for it to be fed. And you've got to get rid of anything that's going to put the fire out. After being in Jerusalem for 12 years on a sabbatical from the Persian palace, remember he was the king's cupbearer, Nehemiah had returned to Persia. We don't know why he chose this time to return or even how long he was gone. It's assumed that he was probably gone for just a few years. But just like their forefathers, when Moses was gone even a shorter amount of time, when their leader wasn't visible anymore, they quickly began to go back to their old ways and habits, their old behaviors and actions, their old lifestyles. And they were no longer upholding their end of their binding agreement with God, their commitment they made in chapter 10. Remember when I told you that walking your Christian journey is like going backwards on that moving sidewalk in the airport? You have to keep moving forward. It takes spiritual muscles to keep moving forward. But the minute you get lazy and you don't have that forward momentum, that sidewalk's moving backwards. You will move backwards if you're not moving forward. There is no stationary ground with God. And if you've turned your back and are walking with the sidewalk, you're going to get farther away quicker than you had anticipated. It's going to happen like that. Complacency and compromise will take you there. The Christian walk takes commitment, it takes dedication, and you must keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, and keep stepping forward. Nehemiah chapter 13 records Nehemiah's return to Jerusalem and what condition he finds it in. So if you will open with me to Nehemiah chapter 13, I'm going to read all of Nehemiah 13 as we read Nehemiah's final reform for the Israelites. I'm going to start with verse 1. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. And when the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were foreign descent. Before this, Eliashib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and the incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain and new wine and oil prescribed by the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. But while all this was going on, I was in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked his permission, and I came back to Jerusalem, and here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw out all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites, the singers responsible for the service, had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials, and I asked them, why is the house of God neglected? And then I called them together and stationed them at their post. All of Judah brought the tithes and new grain and new wine and oil to the storerooms. I put Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan of Zakur, the son of Mathaniah, their assistant, because these men were considered trustworthy. They made responsible for distributing the supplies to their brothers. Remember me for this, O God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they were bringing this all into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. Men of Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your forefathers do the same thing, so our God brought this calamity upon us and upon this city? Now you're stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut, not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice, these merchants and sellers, all kinds of goods, spent the night outside of the Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, "Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you." From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves, to go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, O God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the other language of one of the other people and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and I called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, "You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor take their daughters in marriage for your sons or yourselves." Was it not because of marriage like these among Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the nations where there was no king like him, he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Hornite, and I drove him away from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood of the Levites. So I purified the priests, the Levites, of everything foreign, and assigned them duties, each to his own task. And I also made provisions for contributions of wood at design times for the first fruits. Remember me in your favor, O my God. May God bless the reading of his word. You see, so much has happened here. They have gotten derailed from staying the course with God. The priest had become corrupt. And what was meant for God's work was now taken for personal gain. Tithing was ignored. And the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, they had to leave the temple and go back to their fields and work to survive. The Sabbath wasn't observed. They were more concerned with doing business and getting money than worshiping God. And they had intermarried with foreigners, even with their direct enemies. They became their marriage partners. They had promised God in chapter 10 not to neglect the house of God. 10 verse 39, we will not neglect the house of our God. But Nehemiah finds that it was not only neglected, but it was being abused for personal gain. And as if that were not enough, they were marrying into the enemy nations, making alliances with those who had opposed God, his work, and their nation. Eliashib, the priest that's in charge of the storerooms of the temple, has now married Tobiah's daughter. Remember, Tobiah was one of the main characters who had opposed the work that they were doing. They had mocked God's people and tried to prevent God's work. And now his daughter married the priest who was in charge of the storerooms of the temple. God's word was read to them, and it stated that no Ammonite, no Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God. And now the priest is not only son-in-law to Tobiah, an Ammonite, but he's allowed him to store his stuff, his household goods, in God's house. Folks, there's a problem here. The enemy was not just inside the walls. The enemy is now inside the church, inside the temple, and moving God's stuff out to put his stuff in. And it was blessed by the priest. God's issue here was not a mixed race marriage. God's issue was a mixed faith marriage. Throughout history, it was the mixed faith marriages that led the Israelites to be influenced, to be drawn in to the worship of idolatry. The Israelites understood this, and they promised God, back in chapter 10, verse 30, and I quote, "We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the people around us or take their daughters for our sons." Yet another promise made, not kept. Words are cheap. We can say anything. But if there's true commitment, it will be followed by change of action. We see their actions in verse 13. Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the other languages. They didn't even speak the language of Judah anymore. Just one generation, and they were already losing it. Because their leader had gone back to Persia. You see, when you put your faith in a human being, you will be disappointed. Their leader should have been God, who will never leave them nor forsake them. But this isn't the first time the Israelites did this. And we can all apply it to our lives. The minute we think something isn't going our way, we go back to what's familiar. And that's what they did. You see, when we promise God to change our lives, there needs to be actions to show him our commitment. These actions need to be active in our life every day. Not just Sundays, not just Wednesdays, not just when the pastor's standing next to you, not just when you feel like it or when there's nothing better to do. Every day, all day. God expects us to be faithful to his commands out of love and dedication, not obligation. Desiring to draw closer to him, to stay the course, to being true and loyal to our relationship with him. If we become complacent, we will find that the enemy is not just inside our walls. He'll be in our circle of influence. He will be directly connected to our lives as an alliance, as we compromise. And trouble didn't end there for them. These Israelites were also robbing God with their tithes. It says in Malachi 3, will a man rob God, yet you rob me? But you ask, how do we rob you? In tithes and offerings you are under a curse, the whole nation of you, because you are robbing me. Money speaks. And it wasn't God who was being honored. In chapter 13, it was man. You see the men working in the wine press. They were bringing in the grain and the wine and the grapes and the figs and all other kinds of loads to sell. There were other men selling fish and merchandise all on the Sabbath. They were doing it for money. Their own personal gain. And ignoring God's work. God had commanded Israel not to work on the Sabbath, but to rest in remembrance of creation and their deliverance from Egypt. To keep the Sabbath holy. They were not giving God a tithe or an offering, so the portions assigned to the Levites and the singers were not there. And so they had to leave the temple. They had no way to support themselves. They went to their own fields and worked. They left their temple duties undone, and the spiritual welfare of the people suffered. When we ignore the work of God, and we do things our way, I guarantee you that you will not be the only one it affects. I repeat that. When you do things your own way, you will not be the only person that it affects. And if left uncorrected, these lasting effects of your decisions will reach generations. But the same goes for God's blessings. If you stay the course and you follow God with all of your heart, the lasting effects of that decision will last for generations. After all the challenges, after all the victories, after all the celebration and praise, after all the promises, this is what Nehemiah comes back to. But we will see that he knows what the enemy doesn't want you to know. It is never too late to do what is right. And the enemy will tell you, it's too late. You've screwed up, it's too late. It is never too late to do what is right. And Nehemiah went straight into action when he saw that things were off course. He didn't look at the size of the chaos or how far things had gone off track. He looked at God. And he looked at God's standards. And he fixed his eyes on Jesus. And he moves the people back. Get back in line. Get back on course. I'm not going to look at all this chaos that's going on over here. I'm going to look at God's standard, and I'm going to tell you, you need to be here. And I'm going to do it out of love. And I'm going to try to get you back on course. Come on. Let's get back on course. And he moves the people back towards God. He reprimands those who've gone astray, and he shows them what needs to be done to get back on course. But he didn't do it maliciously. He did it because he loved them. And he wanted them on God's path, not out there in the chaos. And he begins right at God's house, verses 8 and 9. I was greatly displeased and threw out all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the room, and then I put back into them the equipment of God with the grain and the incense. He addressed the neglect of God's house first. The neglect of the Levites and the singers. And he rebukes the officials assigned trustworthy people to be responsible to distributing these supplies, and the tithes were brought in. And he continues to make efforts to bring everybody back on track. And then we see what he does, as is his custom. He prays. Verse 14. He prays as he's about to confront the people about their irreverence of the Sabbath. He reprimands the people for doing business on the Sabbath. He rebukes the nobles for allowing it. He had the gates of the city locked so that no merchants could come in and sell on the Sabbath. And despite some of their efforts, they would hang out by the wall. And then he said, you keep hanging out by the wall, game on. Get away from my wall. I'm going to keep the Sabbath holy. And they stopped coming to the wall. He commanded the Levites to guard the gates, to purify themselves, in order to keep the Sabbath holy. And he set up people and systems to make sure God's laws are heeded and God's ways are followed. He begins this process with prayer. And he ends this process with prayer, as is his custom. You will see the whole book of Nehemiah begins with prayer. And the last verse ends with prayer. Constant communication with God is key to doing God's will in our lives. Fixing your eyes on Jesus throughout the whole process. Even though the people had gotten off course, they had broken their promises, they had turned their back from commitment, it did not disqualify them from serving God. Okay. If they could just get back on course. The enemy is notorious for telling us that we've made too many mistakes. That what we did is too bad to be forgiven. God could never use us. But I know that God is the God of hope, not despair. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Don't let your past keep you from doing what's right. It's never too late to do what's right. The Bible is full of characters and their narratives of people who failed God. Abraham didn't trust God and decided to do things his way to fulfill God's promise. Noah got drunk. David committed adultery and murder. Jacob cheated to gain his father's blessings. Moses murdered an Egyptian and then lost his temper and literally broke the 10 Commandment tablets. Peter lied about knowing Jesus. Paul held the coats of those who had stoned Stephen. And he was torturing Christians. The list could go on, but God used every single one of these men. It doesn't matter what you've done. What matters is what you do next. Right now, to renew your commitment to Him, or for the first time, start your walk with Him. What is most important is to have the wisdom to know to have the courage to admit it. We need to acknowledge God's way, and then we need to take the steps of faith and act. There's always hope in Jesus because he is hope. He is our hope. The choice is ours. The people had reached a spiritual high as they marched on top of those walls, praising God. But as we read, it does not automatically guarantee a lifetime of faithful commitment. Nehemiah and the people faced the same environment. They faced the same obstacles. They dealt with the same issues, the same temptations. They had the same enemies, the same difficulties. They worshiped the same God. They read the same law and had to abide by the same rule. But their response was not the same as Nehemiah's. Why? Why was Nehemiah able to honor God and to remain faithful and stay the course while others failed? Because he had made that choice. He made his relationship with God a priority above everything else. Everything else above his comfort, his job, money, above convenience, everything. You see, his loyalty throughout this book is his prayers. He prays after receiving bad news about Jerusalem. He prays after he had this thing from God saying, you've got to go, and he had a conversation with the king. He prays in the middle of that conversation. He prays after being taunted and ridiculed by Tobiah and Sanballat. He prays when they threatened to attack him. He prays in response to threats. He prays in reflection on the action of his enemy. He prays in reflection on his own efforts to serve God. He prays 4 times in this chapter alone. That's recorded. This entire book has Nehemiah's prayers on and on and on. Nehemiah had chosen a lifestyle that was going to be dependent on God. And in order for that to happen, consistent prayer was key. Given all that the Israelites accomplished under Nehemiah's leadership, he could have chosen to build a monument in his honor, have an inscription written at the bottom, added to the wall. He could have looked at all that he accomplished because he was obedient, and he could have taken pride in that. But that's not where his focus was. His focus was on God's glory. His focus was on God's testimony to the nations. He chose the path of honoring God and obeying him out of love because he loved God so much, even more than self. And in Joshua's day, when the Israelites initially came into this promised land, Joshua gave the same challenge to the people when they first arrived. Choose you this day whom you will serve. And Nehemiah's answer was the same as Joshua's when he proclaimed, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. You have a choice today. This is the choice you can make. I can't make you, your parents, your siblings, your spouse, your kids, your friends. None of them can make that decision for you. Each time you're confronted with an option to honor God by doing what's right or honor self by doing what feels right. Sometimes what feels right will be right. Most times it won't. We, as human nature, we like to do things easy. And usually easy isn't going to be the right thing. And ultimately the choice is yours. To be God's child or to put yourself on the throne. Those are the only 2 choices we have. There is no middle ground. There is no Switzerland in neutral. You're either for God or against him. But if you choose God, he will guide you through each and every circumstance. It's not going to be easy, but it is going to be possible. Because with God, all things are possible. Your life will reflect the results of your choices coming together. As we walk up the down escalator or backwards on that moving sidewalk, we won't be perfect. Our spiritual walks, as we start out, well, our legs are going to get tired. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to go down or up a down escalator, not me because I'm afraid of escalators, but if you've ever tried to do that, I've watched trained athletes compete. They fatigue. It takes work. It takes spiritual muscles. And at times we're going to fall. But God's there to pick us up every time. And the more we do it, the stronger we'll get. Keep moving forward. Jesus will guide us and encourage us with his Spirit. He will enable us to remain steadfast and faithful, but the choice is still ours to stay the course or to go our own way. Don't compromise. Don't get complacent. Stick to the promises you've made to God, because God's promises are solid. They're solid enough to stand on. They're solid enough to march on top of and praise him. When you're standing on the promises of God, you will be part of that unshakable kingdom. Stay the course. His word is a lamp unto your feet and a light unto your path. Jesus himself tells us, I am the way. Psalm 16:11. You make known to me the path of life. You fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. The choice is ours. Stay the course. Stand with me as we close. This morning I want you to fix your eyes on the author and perfecter of your faith. Honor him with your life. Because when we take our eyes off Jesus, just like Peter, we're going to sink. Our lives are going to begin to crumble. In Matthew 7, it tells us plainly that we have a choice. Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many will enter through it. God's commands are not given to restrict us, but rather to guide us to stay the course. So let's go to prayer this morning. Heavenly Father, there is so much chaos in our world today. But there's one God, and that's you. One true God. So Lord, while we struggle to look at all the things around us, Lord, there's just one of you that we need to fix our eyes on as we take each step in our lives. Lord, you are hope, as the Advent so greatly reminds us. In a world that seems hopeless and lost, you are our hope. And like this candle burning in front of us, stir the fire for you in our hearts. Take out all the impurities that might extinguish our fire and help us to go light our world with your hope and your love. Lord, turn our eyes on you. We thank you for all that you're doing. Even when we don't see it, even though we don't feel it, we know you're working and that you're here. That you sent your Son to dwell among us. This Christmas season, help us to remember what a gift that came that Christmas morning. That we still get to enjoy through your Holy Spirit. That you are physically with us. We don't deserve it. We're humbled by it. But we know that your love is immeasurable. And we thank you for that.